Because this class is a cognitive psychology class, we'll focus more on cognitive processes than we will on the brain. In a cognitive neuroscience class, we would talk extensively about the brain and about the cognitive processes. But we will talk some about the brain in this class. And so it's important that you have some understanding of how the brain is organized and the function of different areas of the brain. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail because, again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the brain in this course, but I want enough detail that when I do talk about the brain, you'll have some sense of what I'm talking about. So in this presentation, we're going to go over kind of the organization of the brain from the bottom of the brain up, and then I'll do another presentation talking about the cerebral cortex, which is we will talk about in more detail as we go through this class. Alright, so the nervous system has two main divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is really, it's central in the body. It runs along the midline of the body and includes the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So the peripheral nervous system includes all the nerves entering and exiting through the spine, entering and exiting through the brain itself. Many of those are going to going to the muscles in our face or our sensory systems that come out of our head, like our eyes, our ears, taste, smell. The enteric nervous system is a nervous system that surrounds your entire digestive tract. It works relatively independent of the brain, but there are interconnections between it, and what happens in the brain influences the gut, and what happens in the gut influences the brain. The autonomic nervous system is a system that responds to whatever demands are being put on our body. If I'm walking up a flight of steps, my heart rate will increase because I'm putting more demand on my body. It takes more effort to go up the steps than it does just to walk down a hall. And so the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, increasing heart rate, increasing my breathing. Sympathetic nervous system is also activated by our fight or flight response. And the parasympathetic has generally an opposite effect, a calming effect. So once I get up the steps, go in my office, sit down at my desk, my heart rate will decrease, breathing will decrease, and that's all through the action of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now they're working together, so that my body is working at the optimal level for the demands putting on it. So even though we separate them organizationally, in fact they're working really as one to make sure that my body is doing what I need it to do. And the same thing can be said for the entire nervous system. Even though we create these divisions in it, it's important to recognize it's working together as a whole so that we can do what we need to do. When we look at the brain, it has 5 basic divisions, known as the myelencephalon, metencephalon, mesencephalon, diencephalon, and telencephalon. And I'm going to walk through each of those divisions and some of the structures in it, but let's just kind of take a look at the brain itself right now. Here's the spinal cord, okay? And the spinal cord merges into the bottom part of the brain, and the bottom part of the brain is an area known as the medulla oblongata, and that is the myelencephalon. So that's the first division of the brain. And then as we move up, we see the pons and the cerebellum, and they form the metencephalon. And then above that is what's known as the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. Above that is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and they form the diencephalon. And then above that is the forebrain, or telencephalon, and there are a number. The outer part of that is the cerebral cortex, but underneath that cortex are a number of structures with a variety of functions. Okay? So that's kind of the basic layout of the brain, and it's important really to recognize that The spinal cord is really just this long extension of the brain. It's not like it's some part that's just fitted in there. It's just really your central nervous system extending down through your vertebra. I guess one other point to make is that in terms of function, it becomes much more, the complexity of that function increases significantly as you go up through the division. So spinal cord monitors a lot of local reflexes, mesencephalon, myelin, the whole brainstem is involved in movement, but it gets increasingly complex as you go up, whereas in the telencephalon and in the frontal cortex, we're actually initiating voluntary movement. The brainstem is really, you can see this kind of lighter area coming down to the spinal cord. That's the brainstem. It's composed of the myelencephalon, the medulla oblongata, the metencephalon, the pons and cerebellum, and the midbrain. Okay? And you can see how it looks like this little stem sitting that the rest of the brain sits on top of. Okay? The medulla oblongata contains a number of motor pathways coming down from the cortex, sensory pathways coming up from the body, and it also contains a number of life-sustaining areas. So there's a cardiac center, there's a number of little areas together that are important for swallowing, for initiating our breathing in, out, coordinating all of that. Cardiac center, there's an area that measures the toxins that are in our bloodstream, and if we have high levels of toxins, then we vomit. So we have it's a little kind of a vomit button in our brain. It's known as an emetic. When you're throwing up, you're emitting, you're expelling something, and so it's known as the emetic center. This is why you could have extensive amount of damage in your cortex and still live, and yet a very small amount of damage in the medulla, really in the brainstem itself, can have some very severe functions because of those life-sustaining areas that are located there. The metencephalon is the pons and the cerebellum. Pons means bridge in Latin, and again, there's a number of areas involved in movement, especially around the face, eyes, and also really running through the whole brainstem, but there are a number of areas that are important for general arousal or alertness, okay? And also for generating different stages of sleep. The cerebellum is 80% of all the neurons in the brain. A neuron is the basic brain cell. 80% of the neurons are found in the cerebellum. And you can see, it's a good size, but it's nowhere near the size of the rest of the brain. So it's packed with neurons. And traditionally, we've looked about it in terms of balance and movement, especially coordination of movement. So if you're reaching out to pick up a pen off the desk, this is coordinating all of that. But it's also involved in emotions, and it also plays a significant role in cognition. We won't talk about that much in that class, because that's an area of research that's really just coming forward. As complex as the cerebellum is, it has not been studied as extensively as the rest of the brain. And then right above that is the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. On the roof, or tectum, you don't really need to know that term, but really on the roof of the midbrain, there's 4 bumps. The top, the more superior are the ones that kind of towards the front of the mesencephalon. are known as the superior colliculi, and those are important for eye movements. We talk a lot about that in sensation of movement, and right below that are a smaller set of bumps known as the inferior colliculi, and they're important. They play a role in audition in terms of orienting to sounds, and so between them, they're important in terms of orienting to stimuli in our environment. So if you're walking in the woods and you hear something rustling in the leaves, you're going to stop and turn your head and try to align your vision with where you think you heard that rustling came from, in order so that you can determine what's out there. In the lower part, or the kind of the floor of the midbrain, you have a number of areas that are important for more complex movements like crawling or walking patterns, kind of coordinating with the swinging of your arms, with the movement of your legs as you walk or run, and similar areas such as that. Okay. So that's the brainstem. And next area of the brain, right above the brainstem, you can see this circle where that arrow is, and then right below it in this space, those two areas make up the brainstem. The diencephalon. This oval area is the thalamus. The area below it is the hypothalamus. The most basic way to understand the thalamus is that it's connecting the brainstem and the cortex. So all the sensory pathways coming up through the brainstem go to the thalamus before they come to the cortex. Your visual pathway, if your eye is here, you have the visual nerve coming back. It comes to what's called the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and then that projects to the very back of our brain, which is the primary visual cortex. And then from there it goes to other areas of the cortex. But first it's coming to the thalamus, and then it's coming up. At the same time, all those visual areas of the cortex are coming back down to the thalamus, which means that the information that's coming up is getting processed within the thalamus before we're ever consciously aware of it. So the thalamus is doing more than just relaying stuff back and forth. It's actually processing some of that information. Also, motor areas of the cortex. When we decide we're going to make a movement, like reaching out and picking up a pen off our desk, right? That's initiated up here in the frontal lobe, and then that pathway comes down to the thalamus, and then to the areas of the medulla of the brainstem that are important for kind of generating the pattern of that movement, and then coming down into the thalamus, into the spinal cord, and then out into our arms and hands so that we can reach out and pick that up. Okay, so thalamus is kind of relaying stuff back and forth, but at the same time it's a little more complex than that. It's actually processing and integrating a lot of information as well. The hypothalamus plays a number of roles in behavior. Motivation. There's areas in here that generate eating, thirst regulation, mating behavior. It's also important in stress. It helps initiate the fight or flight response. It also monitors the endocrine system. And so we won't talk a lot about those, but at the same time, let's just say, take an example of decision making, a cognitive process. The type of decision you make often depends on the state you're in. So if you're really, really hungry, you're going to make one kind of decision than if you're not so hungry, right? At least in terms of the type of food that you're going to eat. If you're feeling stressed, it's going to affect your decision making, all right? So we won't talk about that specifically, but realize that a lot of cognitive processes are being influenced by what's going on in the rest of the brain. We can't really separate cognition from our other other aspects of behavior. All right, the telencephalon is the forebrain. It's all the area up above the diencephalon. There's really two. The brain itself is bilaterally symmetrical, so what you see on the right side is mirrored by what you see on the left side. With the cerebral cortex, the right and left hemispheres are connected by a band of fibers known as the corpus callosum. This is this lighter, wider looking area right in here, and you can see how extensive those connections are to connect the two hemispheres. This is the cerebral cortex, the outer part, and you can see all kind of the bumps and the grooves that are characteristic of that cortex. If we were to look under it, we'd see two sets of structures, one known as the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia play a big role in movement. There's a number of movement disorders associated, such as Parkinson's disease. Characteristic deficits in Parkinson's disease are slowness of movement, trouble initiating and stopping movements, a tremor at rest, so they sit as they shake. They shake as they sit as they shake. I don't know, whatever. And so basal ganglia is not thought to be initiating movement as much as that's the cerebral cortex, but helping to coordinate and deciding on the range of movement. Because of the Parkinson's disease, what you see is a deficit in movement. Another movement disorder is called Huntington's chorea, where you have these extreme flailing of arms and limbs, so you see an excess of movement. And that's the basal ganglia is involved in both of those. The limbic system is a ring of structures that basically you see underneath the surface of the cortex that form this essentially a ring around the diencephalon. Historically, the limbic system was seen as being involved in emotion, but reality is that there's really no part of the brain that's specifically associated with any specific emotion. One area of the limbic system, the amygdala, is involved in fear, but there seems to be different types of fear, and so there are other areas beyond just the amygdala involved in that. And the amygdala itself is involved in a number of stereotypical behaviors, and stress response, and maternal behavior, just a number of different things beyond just pure emotion. We will talk about some of these structures within the limbic system. One is the hippocampus. We'll talk about that and its role in memory, also in spatial navigation when we get there. The cingulate cortex, which is this area right above the corpus callosum, it plays a variety of roles in cognition, so we will talk about that some as we go through this class as well. I'm going to talk about the cerebral cortex in another video, but again, that's this area is the most outer area of the forebrain, and it's the most prominent looking structure when you look at just a raw brain. Okay, and so that's all I have to say about the brain for now.